Vayrith didn't end up with fire or spectacle. It failed the way a body fails when every system collapses at once. The atmosphere folding inward with a pressure so sudden and absolute, the surface buckled before most species understood anything had happened. Forests flattened as if an invisible hand had pressed down on them. Mountain ranges cracked open with the sound too deep to hear, only feel. Cities folded into themselves like soft metal, the ground swallowing them with a slow, grinding patience. Oceans rose in towering walls of steam that fell as boiling sheets of water, erasing coastlines in minutes. The sky flickered through violent shifts of color, blue to black, to a blinding white glare, before settling into a washed-out emptiness that felt less like weather and more like the planet's final exhale. There was no roar, no firestorm, no spectacle. Just the quiet, catastrophic failure of a world that had been dying far longer than anything living on it ever realized. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that comes after something enormous has stopped breathing. The Rel weren't a dominant species then. They had no language, no rituals, no sense of a future. They existed the way pressure exists, the way darkness exists, without intention, without identity, without anything resembling fear. Their bodies were built for crushing depths and violent shifts, their senses tuned to faint vibrations, their nerves hardened by generations of predation. When the atmosphere collapsed, they didn't panic. They adapted. Their skin thickened as the air thinned, their limbs reconfigured to brace against the distortions, their lungs sealed as oxygen vanished, their eyes darkened against the blinding light. Their bodies rewrote themselves in seconds, as if the planet's death was just another environmental shift to endure. Other species died instantly. The Rel absorbed the terror around them, the way a sponge absorbs water, though they had no concept of terror yet. They felt the psychic pressure of billions of organisms dying at once, a wave of emotional residue so dense it pressed against their skin like heat. They inhaled it, without understanding what they were taking in, and their bodies convulsed as something inside them shifted in a way that would define their species forever. The first nightmare feeding happened in the ruins of a city whose name had already been stripped from the collapsing air. A psychic shockwave rolled across the surface as the last of Vayrith's sentient species screamed in unison. The Rel absorbed it. Their instincts changed in an instant. Terror became sustenance. Emotional residue became nourishment. The death of their world didn't weaken them. It refined them. Vayrith died in hours. The Rel survived in minutes. When the planet finally folded into a dense, silent sphere of dead rock, the Rel were already something new. Their bodies elongated, their joints multiplied, their skin darkened to a deep, lightless black that reflected nothing. Their senses expanded beyond the physical world. They no longer needed air or light or food. They needed only the emotional residue of terror, the psychic echo of sentient minds breaking under pressure. They fed on the last screams of their world and emerged as creatures built for extinction. When Vayrith finally went silent, the Rel drifted into space. They didn't build ships at first. They drifted as organisms carried by the remnants of their world's collapse, feeding on the residues of dying stars and the psychic residue of cosmic events. Over centuries, they learned to shape matter through instinct rather than intelligence, building vessels that were more like extensions of their bodies than machines. Their ships didn't fly. They hungered. They drifted through the void, feeding on whatever fear they could find, until they sensed something new, something rich, dense, fragile. Earth. They didn't marvel at it. They didn't study it. They sensed the emotional potential, the density of sentient minds, the fragility of human psychology. Earth wasn't a discovery. It was a feeding ground, a resource, a planet waiting to be harvested. They scanned continents, cities, towns. They rejected cities as too chaotic. They wanted isolation, predictability, a population small enough to control, but large enough to sustain them. Ashwood sat in the middle of a forested valley with a population under 3,000 and a geological fault line that made psychic manipulation easier. The emotional signatures were dense and fractured in ways that made the work simple. The sheriff's house carried a grief that hadn't settled. The girl's mind held the restless instability of someone who never slept deeply. The pastor's pressure sat just beneath the surface, quiet but volatile. The ship absorbed the pattern and adjusted its internal structure with a slow, instinctive shift. At 2:14 a.m., the vessel entered Earth's atmosphere. No alarm sounded, no satellites tracked it, no human eyes saw it. The clouds parted like a curtain and the ship slid through, silent and unlit, invisible to radar. It settled in the woods behind the town's water tower, hovering 30 meters above the tree line. It didn't land. It didn't announce itself. It simply watched. Inside, the rail moved with a fluid coordination that had nothing to do with communication and everything to do with instinct. They began mapping the town, moving through it house by house and mind by mind. Emotional signatures lit up like veins under a scanner. Grief, guilt, fear, shame, rage. Patterns they recognized immediately. The ship adjusted again, a slow internal shift that meant the process had already begun. The first disturbances were small enough that no one connected them. A dog refusing to enter the kitchen, a girl waking with a taste of metal in her mouth, a pastor staring at the far wall of the sanctuary with the uneasy sense that something behind him had just stepped out of sight, a farmer convinced he heard someone breathing under the floorboards. The rail didn't need to touch anything physical. They worked through pressure, through the thin membrane between waking and dreaming, through the emotional fractures that made certain minds easier to bend. The sheriff's grief made him an open door. The girl's sleep paralysis made her a perfect conduit. The pastor's faith made him vulnerable in ways he didn't understand. The nightmares came next. The sheriff found himself back in the hospital room he'd spent months trying to forget. The machines humming, the air thick with antiseptic, his wife lying motionless on the bed. When she sat up and smiled with a face that no longer belonged to her, the room folded inward and swallowed the light. He woke with his chest heaving, convinced something had followed him back into the waking world. The girl lay pinned to her mattress by the familiar weight of paralysis. Her sister appeared at the foot of the bed with hollow eyes and a crudely sealed mouth. The walls pulsed with a slow, suffocating rhythm. The ceiling cracked open as if something above her wanted to come through. She surfaced from the nightmares in tears, shaking hard enough she had to sit on the edge of the bed until the room stopped tilting. The pastor dreamed of the church engulfed in flames. The pews melted into the floor while shadowed figures sat in the front row and peeled their faces away with slow, methodical movements. He woke with his hands pressed together, whispering a prayer he didn't remember starting. The farmer dreamed of his wife standing in the field at dawn, waving to him with a calm expression before the soil softened beneath her feet and pulled her under. He clawed at the ground in his sleep and came awake covered in dirt. Each nightmare deepened the emotional saturation of the town, creating a feedback loop that strengthened the rail's influence. The ship adjusted again, its internal structure shifting as the next stage settled into place. They chose a night with no moon, no wind, no interference. A psychic pressure rolled across Ashwood with the kind of weight that didn't wake anyone screaming, but forced every sleeper to surface with the same tightness in their chest, as if something enormous had leaned over the town during the night and waited for breath to return. The sheriff stayed on the porch longer than he meant to, the gun resting on his thigh while the morning light crawled across the boards in thin, washed-out streaks. The girl lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for the heaviness in the room to lift, but the air held its shape around her like a hand pressed against her ribs. The pastor sat alone in the basement, with his hands pressed together, trying to steady the tremor in his breath as the walls around him carried a faint vibration that didn't belong to the building. The farmer's house stayed dark, the windows reflecting nothing. The lines between what people dreamed and what they woke into had thinned overnight, leaving the town with the sense of having crossed into something it didn't remember choosing. The air felt stretched, the light felt wrong. The silence carried a weight that didn't match the hour. Something moved through the trees behind the sheriff's house just after dawn. A tall, thin figure with limbs that bent in ways that didn't match any anatomy he knew. Skin that didn't reflect the light so much as swallow it. A posture too rigid to be human. It paused at the edge of the yard with a stillness that made the air feel heavier, as if the world around it had been told to stop moving. When it raised one arm in a slow, controlled gesture, the sheriff felt the pressure shift again, subtle but unmistakable, like the air had been waiting for that movement. The descent had already happened. The breach was next. He woke before sunrise with a heaviness that didn't feel like exhaustion so much as something pressing down from above, the kind of weight that made him sit on the edge of the bed and listen for the usual sounds of the house. Nothing came. The silence felt thick enough he had to clear his throat just to break it. He walked through the kitchen with slow, measured steps, his hand brushing the counter as if he needed the contact to stay steady. The air carried a faint vibration he couldn't place, something low and steady that made the floor feel softer under his boots. He stopped at the doorway to the spare bedroom. He hadn't opened it in months, not since the funeral. Not since he boxed up the last of her clothes and shoved them inside without looking too closely at anything. The door sat slightly ajar now. The gap narrowed but noticeable, and a cold wave crawled up his spine as he stepped closer. The knob turned under his hand with a resistance that didn't feel mechanical. The room beyond was dark, the air colder than the rest of the house, the kind of cold that didn't come from temperature, but from something sitting in the space where warmth should have been. He reached for the light switch with a hand that shook more than he wanted to admit. The bulb flickered once before settling into a weak, uneven glow. Nothing looked disturbed. The boxes were still stacked in the corner. The bed still held a thin layer of dust. The curtains hung unevenly, same as always. But the air carried a faint vibration that made his skin crawl, a slow, steady pulse traveling up through the floorboards like something beneath the house was breathing. He stepped back into a muttered curse, his jaw tightening as the floor shifted again under his boots. He closed the door without looking inside a second time and walked down the hallway with a tension that made his shoulders ache. Outside, the woods behind the house stood still for the hour. The branches didn't sway. The leaves didn't rustle. The air didn't move. He scanned the tree line with a tightness in his chest, waiting for something to shift. When it finally did, the movement was subtle. Such a slight lean of a tall, thin shape standing between the trees. Its limbs were too long, its posture too rigid, its presence too heavy. He blinked hard, hoping the shape would vanish when his eyes refocused, but it didn't. It leaned slightly to one side, as if adjusting its view of him. He reached for the gun at his hip with a hand that shook more than he wanted to admit. The figure didn't move. The air thickened. The ground pulsed once beneath him, a slow, steady throb that matched the rhythm he'd felt in the spare bedroom. He tightened his grip on the gun, his breath caught halfway between a warning and a question he didn't want answered. The figure raised one arm in a slow, controlled gesture, and the sheriff froze. The gesture wasn't threatening. It wasn't aggressive. It looked almost familiar, almost human, almost like someone trying to get his attention. He stepped back, his boots crunching on the gravel, and the figure lowered its arm with a fluid movement that made the air ripple. He didn't wait for anything else. He turned toward the truck with a tightness in his chest that made it hard to breathe, his hand still wrapped around the gun as he climbed inside and slammed the door shut. The engine caught on the second try. He didn't look back at the woods as he pulled out of his driveway. The figure didn't follow. It didn't need to. The pressure in the air stayed with him long after he reached the edge of town. The girl hadn't slept in any way that counted. She drifted in and out of shallow dreams that felt more like static than rest, her body jerking awake every time the pressure in the room shifted. The house settled around her with slow, groaning sounds that reminded her too much of footsteps on the other side of the wall. She sat on the edge of the bed with her knees pulled up, her arms wrapped around them, her breath uneven as she stared at the corner where the shadows gathered in a way that made her skin crawl. The air felt thick enough to chew, the kind of heaviness that made her jaw clench. She crossed the room with slow, cautious steps, her fingers brushing the curtain as she pulled it back. The yard was dark, the trees packed tightly enough that the moonlight barely touched the ground. She scanned the shadows with a tension that made her shoulders ache. At first she saw something, just the fence, the faint glint of the neighbor's porch light, the dark mass of the woods beyond. Then she noticed a shape near the tree line. Tall, thin, limbs too long, posture too rigid. It stood perfectly still, its presence heavy enough she felt it in her chest. She blinked hard, hoping the shape would vanish when her eyes refocused. But it didn't. It leaned slightly to one side, as if adjusting its view of her. She stepped back quickly, her breath catching, and the curtain fell from her hand. The air in the room thickened, the shadows shifting in a slow, fluid motion that made her skin crawl. The floor pulsed once beneath her feet, a slow, steady throb that matched the rhythm she felt at the warped house. She whispered a quiet curse under her breath as she backed away from the window, her hands shaking as she grabbed her phone from the nightstand. The screen lit her face with a pale glow that made the room feel even darker. The house groaned again, low and uneven, and she froze with her fingers hovering over the screen. The pressure settled over her chest in a way that reminded her too much of her paralysis episodes. Except, this time she could move. She crossed the room with slow, measured steps, her breath uneven as she reached the door and pressed her ear against it. The hallway was silent. The air didn't move. The house felt like it was holding its breath. She walked downstairs with her hand on the railing, each step careful, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The kitchen lights flickered once, and a quick pulse that made her stop at the bottom of the stairs. The air felt heavier near the back door, the kind of heaviness that made her stomach twist. She stepped closer, her breath caught halfway between fear and curiosity, and she reached for the handle with a hand that shook more than she wanted to admit. The metal was warm. She jerked her hand back, her heart pounding, and the house shifted around her with a slow groaning sound that made her chest tighten. She didn't open the door. She didn't need to. Something outside had already found her. She walked back upstairs with the tension that made her legs feel unsteady, her breath uneven as she closed the bedroom door behind her. The pressure in the room settled again, heavier this time, and she sat at the edge of the bed with her phone in her hands, waiting for the next shift in the air. It didn't take long. The pastor woke before dawn with the sense that something beneath the church had shifted in the night. It wasn't a sound or a dream or anything he could point to. It was the kind of instinct that settled low in the chest and refused to move. A pressure that made him sit up slowly and stare at the far wall until the feeling sharpened into something colder. He dressed without turning on the lights and crossed the sanctuary with slow, steady steps, his hand brushing the backs of the pews as if he needed the contact to stay upright. The air was colder than it should have been, the kind of cold that didn't come from temperature, but from something sitting in the room that didn't belong there. The stained glass windows cast faint, distorted colors across the floor. The shapes stretched in ways he didn't remember, as if the glass had softened overnight. He paused at the top of the basement stairs with his hand on the railing. The darkness below felt thicker than usual, the kind of darkness that didn't just fill a space, but pressed outward, as if it had weight. He descended slowly, each step measured, his breath caught halfway between caution and something closer to instinct. The basement had always been cold, always been damp, always felt like a place where the air didn't move. But this morning, the silence carried a density that made his ears ring. The walls seemed to lean inward. The air held a faint vibration that didn't match anything mechanical. He crossed the room with careful steps, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Nothing shifted. Nothing breathed. Nothing waited for him in the corners. But the pressure grew heavier the closer he came to the far wall, the one that backed up against the cemetery. He pressed his palm against the concrete and felt warmth radiating through it, a slow, steady pulse that didn't belong to stone. He stepped back with a shaky exhale, his hand trembling as he wiped it on his pants. He didn't remember deciding to go outside. One moment he was staring at the wall, the next he was walking through the cemetery with a shovel in his hand, the early morning light casting long, thin shadows across the rows of headstones. The ground felt warm beneath his boots, the warmth rising through the soles in a way that made his stomach twist. He stopped at a patch of earth that looked no different from the rest, but the pressure beneath it was unmistakable. He pressed the shovel into the soil with a slow, steady movement. The blade sank deeper than it should have. He dug until the dirt shifted under the shovel with a dull, solid sound. He knelt with a slow, careful movement, brushing the soil away with his hands. The edge of a wooden box emerged from the earth. The wood darkened with age. The surface warmed beneath his fingers. He uncovered the lid, his breath uneven, and whispered a quiet prayer as he reached for the handle. The lid lifted with a soft groan, the hinges resisting as if they hadn't been touched in decades. A layer of cloth covered whatever lay inside, the fibers brittle, the color drained to a lifeless gray. He reached for the edge with a hand that shook more than he wanted to admit. The cloth shifted under his fingers, a faint, almost imperceptible movement that made his breath catch. He pulled his hand back quickly, staring at the box with the tightness in his chest that made it hard to breathe. The ground pulsed once beneath him, a slow, steady throb that made the headstone tremble. He stumbled back, his boots sliding in the loose soil, and the cloth shifted again, the movement more pronounced this time. The air thickened around him, the pressure rising until his ears rang. He whispered another prayer, the words trembling, and the ground opened with a soft, sighing sound, the earth folding back like fabric pulled from beneath a weight. The shape beneath the cloth rose with a fluid movement that defied gravity, its limbs unfolding in ways that made his stomach twist. The air rippled around it, the pressure building until he fell to his knees. The creature stepped forward with a slow, controlled grace, its presence heavy enough to make the world blur at the edges. He didn't run. He couldn't. The ground held him in place as the creature leaned toward him, its limbs bending in a way that suggested curiosity rather than aggression. The pressure settled over him like a hand pressed against his ribs. He closed his eyes as the world dissolved into muted colors. The girl walked toward the school with her backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes fixed on the ground as she replayed the figure outside her window. The morning air felt heavier than usual, the kind of heaviness that made her jaw clench. She kept glancing at the houses as she passed them, noticing details she'd never paid attention to before. The windows looked slightly taller, the roofs steeper, the doors narrower. The angles didn't match the way she remembered them. It was subtle enough she questioned whether anything had changed at all, but the unease in her chest didn't fade. She reached the corner near the old gas station and stopped. The road ahead bent in a way that didn't match the map she'd walked her entire life. The curve was sharper. The houses sat farther apart. The trees leaned inward as if pulled by some unseen weight. She took a slow step forward, her breath uneven, and the air thickened around her. The pressure settled over her chest in a way that reminded her too much of her paralysis episodes, except this time, she could move. She kept walking, her steps careful, her eyes scanning the distorted streets. The school entrance looked normal from a distance, but the closer she got, the more wrong it felt. The door handle carried a faint smear of dirt, the same dirt she'd seen near her locker, the same dirt the sheriff had wiped from the bulletin board. the same dirt the pastor had brushed from the wooden box. She touched the handle with her fingertips, expecting it to feel cold. The metal was warm, almost pulsing. She jerked her hand back with a quiet curse as the door creaked open on its own. The hallway beyond was empty. The lights flickered in uneven patterns that made the shadows shift. She stepped inside with slow, cautious movements, her breath uneven as the air thickened around her. The lockers looked slightly warped, the edges bending inwards as if the metal had softened. The floor carried a faint vibration that traveled up through her shoes. She walked toward her classroom with her hand brushing the wall, their surface warm under her palm. Across town, the sheriff drove without remembering how he'd started the truck. He found himself parked near the old grain silos, with the engine idling and the radio hissing with the low, uneven static that didn't match any station he knew. The sky above him shifted through muted shades of gray that made the horizon look scraped thin. He stepped out of the truck with a slow, cautious movement, his boots crunching on the gravel as he scanned the fields. The silos stood in a crooked line, the metal sides warped in subtle ways that made them look like they were leaning toward him. He walked toward the nearest one, his breath caught halfway between a warning and something closer to resignation. The metal surface carried the same faint smear of dirt he'd seen in the station. He touched it with his fingertips. The surface was warm, almost pulsing. He stepped back quickly as the silo groaned with the low, resonant sound that made the air ripple. The ground shifted beneath him, the gravel sliding in a slow, unnatural movement. He stumbled back as the silo leaned forward with a creaking sound that made his chest tighten. The girl sat in the back of the diner after school with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, her fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic as she stared at the window. Her mother moved between tables with the same tired grace she'd always had, but her movements looked slower, heavier, as if the air resisted her. The lights flickered above the counter, the bulbs humming with a low vibration that made the shadows shift. The girl glanced at the window again and froze when she saw the faint outline of a figure standing across the street. Tall, thin, limbs too long, posture too rigid. It leaned slightly to one side, as if adjusting its view of her. She whispered a quiet curse under her breath and stood from the booth, her breath uneven as she grabbed her jacket. The air outside hit her with a coldness that didn't match the season. The figure didn't move. The streetlights flickered in unison, the bulbs humming with a low vibration that made the shadows stretch across the pavement. She stepped onto the sidewalk with her heart pounding, her breath caught in her throat as she took another step forward. Across town, the pastor crawled backward across the cemetery grass, his breath uneven as a creature from the box approached with a slow, fluid movement. The ground pulsed beneath him, the headstones trembling in a way that made the air ripple. The creature reached out with one long, thin arm, its hand hovering inches from his face. The pressure settled over him like a weight. He closed his eyes as the world dissolved into muted colors. The thinning had already begun. The town was shifting. The boundaries were failing, and the rail were moving through the cracks. He raised the gun with a hand that shook harder than he wanted to admit. The figure didn't react. The ground pulsed once beneath him, a slow, steady throb that matched the rhythm he'd felt in the spare bedroom. The kind of rhythm that didn't belong to anything living. He tightened his grip and fired. The bullet passed through the figure without slowing, without striking anything solid, without leaving a mark. The figure tilted its head, studying the path the projectile had taken as if the air itself had been more interesting than the shot. The sheriff lowered the gun slowly, his breath caught in his throat. The air thickened again, the pressure rising until his ears rang. The figure stepped closer with the slow, fluid movement that made the world ripple at the edges, as if reality had to stretch to make room for it. He stumbled back, his boots scraping against the gravel, and the ground opened beneath him with a soft, sighing sound. The earth didn't collapse. It shifted. It made room. Across town, the girl ran from the diner with her jacket half zipped, her breath tearing through her chest. The streetlights flickered in uneven patterns that made the shadows stretch across the pavement like something reaching. She didn't look back. She didn't slow down. She stopped only when she reached the intersection near the school and saw the road bending in a way that made her stomach twist. The asphalt curved into an impossible angle that led straight into the woods. The trees shifted with a slow, unnatural movement, their branches bending toward her as if they recognized her. She stepped forward with a shaky exhale, the air thickening around her. The woods opened into a clearing she had never seen before. The ground pulsed beneath her feet, a slow, steady rhythm that made her knees tremble. The ship hovered above the trees, its surface rippling like water, its presence heavy enough to make her chest tighten. She froze when she saw the sheriff standing near the edge of the clearing, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the figure in front of him. Across the cemetery, the pastor crawled backward across the grass, his breath uneven as the creature from the box approached with a slow, fluid movement. The ground pulsed beneath him, the headstones trembling in a way that made the air ripple. The creature reached out with one long, thin arm, its hand hovering inches from his face. The pressure settled over him like a weight. He closed his eyes as the world dissolved into muted colors. The breach wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was a shift in the air, a thinning of the world, a quiet opening that let something else step through. The girl stepped into the clearing with slow, cautious movement, her breath uneven as the ship lowered with a controlled grace that made the trees bend inward. The air carried a pressure that settled over her chest, the same weight she'd felt in her room, the same rhythm she'd felt in the warped hallway at school. She saw the sheriff standing near the center of the clearing, his posture steady now, his shoulders relaxed in a way that didn't match the tension in the air. He turned toward her with a look that made her chest tighten. Not fear, not confusion, something closer to acceptance. The figure beside him stood still, its limbs bending in subtle fluid movements that made the air ripple. The ground pulsed beneath them, a slow, steady throb that matched the rhythm of the ship. The sheriff took a step forward, his breath steady. The girl reached for his arm, her fingers brushing his sleeve. He gave her a small nod, the kind that said he understood something she didn't. The figure raised one arm in a slow, controlled gesture, and the sheriff stepped into the light spilling from the ship. His body dissolved into muted colors, the edges blurring as he passed through. The girl watched him go with her breath caught in her throat, her hands shaking. She whispered his name under her breath as the light faded. The ship pulsed once, a slow, steady throb, and then it rose into the sky with a fluid movement that made the trees bend inward. The air thinned, the shadows settled, the clearing returned to stillness. Across town, the pastor stayed on his knees in the cemetery with the open box beside him. The cloth pushed aside, the creature gone. The ground eased back into place with a slow, settling shift. The pulse fading until the soil felt ordinary again. The headstone stood still in the early light, but the weight in his chest didn't move. He stayed there longer than he meant to, trying to understand whether the quiet around him was relief or something waiting. In the clearing, the girl stood alone with her breath unsteady, staring at the empty space where the ship had hovered. The woods felt wrong in their stillness, as if the trees were listening for something that hadn't finished happening. The pressure in the air had lifted, but the silence that followed carried its own heaviness, the kind that made her feel like the ground was holding a secret it wasn't ready to release. The sheriff was gone. The rail were gone. The town didn't feel saved. It felt paused, like everything had shifted a few inches to the left and no one would have noticed. The quiet held its shape around her, steady and patient, as if whatever had passed through hadn't closed the door behind it. Something had changed, and the change wasn't finished. The town didn't feel haunted. It felt paused, as if something had moved through and left the air holding its shape around the absence. The quiet stayed long after the last lights went out, settling over the streets and houses with a patience that didn't feel like it belonged to the people living there. The night didn't shift. The wind didn't pick up. The shadows didn't move. The stillness carried its own kind of attention, steady and unblinking, as if the town had become something worth studying. Nothing stirred in the dark, but the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt like the beginning of a long inhale. Ashwood didn't return to normal after the breach. It settled into something quieter, something stretched thin, as if the town had been pulled through a narrow space and hadn't snapped back into shape. People moved through their days with the kind of caution usually reserved for walking across ice, testing each step without knowing why. The air carried a faint vibration that no one talked about but everyone felt, a low hum that lived just beneath the threshold of hearing. It wasn't loud enough to name, but it was constant enough to change the way people breathed. The sheriff's absence hung over the town in a way that didn't feel like grief. It felt like a missing piece of structure, something load-bearing that had been removed without warning. Deputies filled the station with quiet voices and restless movements, their radios hissing with static that didn't match any frequency they recognized. They checked the woods. They checked the silos. They checked the roads leading out of town. Nothing shifted. Nothing answered. Nothing returned. The pastor moved through the church with a tension he couldn't shake, his steps slower, his breath uneven in the sanctuary's stale air. The building felt different now. The walls held a warmth that didn't belong to the heating system. The basement carried a faint pulse that came and went without pattern. He kept the lights on longer than usual, not because he feared the dark, but because the dark felt aware of him. The girl walked through school hallways that looked the same but felt wrong. The angles didn't match her memory. The lockers seemed closer together. The windows sat a little higher. The shadows held their shape too long. She caught herself glancing at the corners before turning them, waiting for something to shift in the air the way it had the night the ship hovered over the clearing. Nothing moved, but the stillness carried its own kind of attention. People whispered about the weather, about the way the wind avoided the valley, about the nights that felt too quiet, about the animals that stopped crossing the roads, about the static that clung to the edges of conversations. No one said the word rel. No one said ship. No one said breach. But the silence around those things grew heavier with each passing day. Ashwood didn't feel haunted. It felt observed, not watched by eyes, but by something patient enough to wait for the right moment to move again. Whatever had passed through the town hadn't closed the door behind it, and the town could feel the draft.